All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and welcome to tonight's webinar, Australia's Greatest Wartime Mysteries, the M24 Midget sub with Stirling Smith. We really appreciate you all joining us tonight, and we are so grateful to be joined by Maritime Archaeologist Stirling Smith. Just a little bit of background on Stirling before we get started. Stirling Smith is an archaeologist with extensive experience working throughout Australia and overseas. He specialises in maritime archaeology, military and polar heritage, and has worked extensively in Aboriginal and historical archaeology. He currently works as the Senior Maritime Archaeology Officer with Heritage New South Wales, Department of Premier and Cabinet, and is the current president of the Australasian Institute for Maritime Archaeology, AIMA. Stirling, thank you so much for joining us. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pop myself on mute now and hand it over to you.
So look, I'll try to cover a lot in this talk, but I'm really going to start off by looking at the background of the Midget submarine attacks on Sydney Harbour. Then I'll look at a little bit about the discovery. Then I'll talk about the management of the site and what we've been doing since its discovery in 2006. And then towards the end, I'd like to start talking about the future and how we're going to go forward with the site, and in particular, visitation to the site. So to start off with, I'll just go a little bit into the background of the raid. So in December 1941, Japan undertakes an attack on Pearl Harbor and starts the Pacific Campaign, bringing America into World War II. Now, most people would think of this raid as being pretty much an airborne attack from carrier-borne aircraft, but it actually contained 5 midget submarines in the attack plan as well. Unfortunately, all of the 5 submarines didn't really succeed in their aims of getting into Pearl Harbor, although recent times a lot of historians think that actually a couple of them might have actually made it into the harbor itself. All of the midgets were lost during the raid. And you can see the image on the screen there on the bottom left-hand side. That's actually one of the midgets that was ended up on the beach. And in fact, the crew member of that, one of the crew members of that submarine actually became the first prisoner of war from the Japanese. So the Imperial Japanese Navy realized that the submarine attack on Pearl Harbor didn't necessarily go particularly well, and there was a few flaws with the campaign. They developed new tactics, and also they upgraded the midget subs, and then decided to have 2 more attacks. So in 1942, on the 29th, 2 submarine attack groups formed up. One of the attack groups attacked Diego Suarez in Madagascar. Now, this raid involved 2 midget submarines. They fired their torpedoes. One of the torpedoes sank the tanker, the British Loyalist, and the second torpedo attack was on the HMS Ramillies. Ramillies wasn't sunk, but it was quite severely damaged. Now, at the same time, 5 I-class submarines appeared off Sydney Harbour, about 30 nautical miles out to sea. Now, 3 of the I-class submarines actually were carrying midget submarines on their casings on the back of the submarines, and you can see the image on the top right hand there shows how the midgets were on carried on the I-class submarines. And the other 2 I-class were actually carrying float planes. Now, the I-class submarines were extremely large. They were about 400 feet long, had a crew of about 144. So the I-class carried the midget submarines, the A-class. Now, these were the Type A Kaihoteki class. Now, after the raid on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese actually improved the versions and called them version 1. Now, these versions were updated by including wire cutters on the bow, and I'll see if I can get my pointer to work here. So they have improved wire cutters here. They also had these interrupter wires that carried up to a second set of wire cutters here and another interrupter wire going down here. They put these into place to try and get the submarines through the anti-boom defense. Now, the Type A's had a crew of 2. They're about 78.5 feet long and only 5.5 feet wide, so relatively small. Their main armament was 2 Type 97 torpedo tubes. They were electrically powered, battery compartments in the forward and aft section. And they also carried a scuttling charge. Now, these submarines were not designed to be suicide weapons. They were designed to actually go into battle and then return to their mother submarines. They were meant to be recharged, resupplied, and then sent back into battle again. So on the 29th of May, a Glenn float plane was launched from about 15, 20 nautical miles off of Sydney. And this was the final reconnaissance mission over Sydney Harbour. The Japanese wanted to have a look and find out what targets were actually in Sydney Harbour at the time. And this is a nice painting here of the Glen floatplane. The Glen came in over Macquarie Lighthouse. It actually went down the harbour. It went all the way down as far as Cockatoo Island, did a circle, and then went back out again. Now, it was actually noted that there was a float plane flying over Sydney Harbour, but at the time it was actually considered that it was an American float plane, and the alarm wasn't raised until the float plane was actually well and truly gone. Now, on returning to the mother submarine, the Glen actually crashed on landing. The crew was able to get off and report that there were a number of ships in the harbour that could be attacked. And it's interesting to note that they didn't recover the Glen floatplane at the time. It was too severely damaged. So they actually pierced the pontoons and it was sunk. So somewhere off Sydney, somewhere out there is actually the remains of a World War II Glen floatplane, which is certainly something that we'd like to find in the future. So just to give you an idea of the harbour defences in Sydney at 1942. Sydney was considered to be reasonably well back from the front line. It wasn't necessarily considered to be a mainline target, but it did have a number of defences. So on the left here, you can see there were 6 outer indicator loops. Now, these indicator loops were large copper insulated wires that were put on the seafloor and electrical currents passed through them. Now, the idea is that any ferrous metal object like a ship or a submarine, if it goes over the top of it, it sets off a signal and you'll be able to tell if there's something coming in. Now, the outer indicator loops at the time of the raid, some of them weren't working, and the ones that were working weren't known to be particularly accurate. So any signals that came from them, they weren't necessarily thinking that it might be a target. There was actually 2 indicator loops that were working at the time, and that was inner loop number 11 and inner loop number 12. And also there was a boom net that was across from Chowder Bay. Now, this boom defence wasn't quite completed at the time of the raid, so the western end of the boom gate was actually open. Now, the reconnaissance mission flown by the Glen had actually identified a number of targets. Now, the 2 main targets that the midget subs were told to aim for was the USS Chicago, an American heavy cruiser, and also HMAS Canberra, which was moored over here as well, another cruiser. So at approximately 8 p.m. on the 31st of May, the M27, which is the first of the 3 midgets to enter the harbour. Now, the M27 works its way up as far as the western gate on the boom defence. Unfortunately for the crew, the submarine actually struck the channel marker, the pile marker. After it hit it, it then reversed back, but the propellers became entangled in the boom defences. Now, the submarine broke the surface and was noticed. A Maritime Services Board watchman was sent out to investigate, and he went out on a wooden rowing boat and came back and said he thinks he's found a tiny midget submarine. And the alarm was raised. Now, at the time, the officer in charge of the defence of Sydney Harbour was Rear Admiral Muirhead Gould. He actually didn't believe the reports at first, so 2 patrol boats were sent out to investigate. They also reported that they'd found a submarine. HMAS Lolita was actually brought into action, and she dropped 2 depth charges to try and destroy the sub. Unfortunately, they were set for a greater depth than was in the harbour, and both of the depth charges didn't detonate. Meanwhile, the crew of the M27 had realised that they couldn't escape, they couldn't get the submarine clear, and obviously that they had been discovered. So the crew decided that the best thing for them to do was actually detonate their scuttling charges, and in the process actually killed themselves. So you can see the damage that was created, you know, on the image in front of you there. Basically destroyed the front of the submarine and killed the 2 crew on board. At about 9:48, the M24 enters the harbour. It's the second submarine to enter the harbour. It's able to work its way up, all the way up towards Garden Island. It first appears off the starboard side of HMS Chicago, which is off Garden Island here. It was actually noticed by the crew, and they did open fire on it. Unfortunately, because the submarine was so low in the water, the Chicago couldn't depress her guns low enough. So it wasn't able to actually directly fire on the submarine. However, a number of the rounds skipped off the water. Some of them ended up in Cremorne, some of them ended up in Mossman, and a few of them actually hit the Martello Tower on Fort Denison. The M24 submerged and was able to work its way back to the stern of the Chicago, where she reappeared. And you can see by the image here, this is what we believe the torpedo paths were. So The M24 fired its first torpedo, which actually went down the port side of Chicago. Now that torpedo hit the seawall at Garden Island underneath the converted ferry, HMS Kuttabul, and blowing it up. The second torpedo went down the starboard side of the Chicago and actually went up onto Garden Island and didn't actually detonate. The two images you can see there of the two torpedoes, the one on the top is the one that didn't detonate, but the one underneath, is actually the remains of the torpedo that destroyed the Kuttabul. And that's on display at the Royal Australian Navy Heritage Centre at Garden Island. And if anyone hasn't been down there, I'd highly recommend having a look at it. It's quite a fascinating collection. So the torpedo that the M24 fired hit the seawall and blew up under Kuttabul, basically broke the spine of the vessel, blew it in half almost, and it sank almost immediately. It killed 21 crew, 19 Australian Navy and 2 British naval personnel. It sank within about 5 minutes, but there's a number of stories of very brave attempts. There was a bandsman by the name of Cumming who actually dived back in and pulled 3 or 4 of his fellow crew out of the water, and another one called Coombs who actually recovered 2 of the people and pulled them out of the wreckage as well. The torpedo also severely damaged the submarine that was moored next to the Kuttabul, and that was the Dutch submarine, the K9. Now, unfortunately, the Dutch K9 submarine had a very checkered history. It had been brought out of Java when the Japanese invaded there, brought to Australia. It was severely damaged by the submarine, by the torpedo from the M24. It spent many months being rebuilt. It was then actually passed over to the Royal Australian Navy, who found that the thing wasn't very reliable. It actually had a major fire and explosion on board when its batteries failed. They were mainly using it for anti-submarine detection practice, but it was never a very successful vessel. And by the 1950s, it was actually been sold off for scrap. And on its way being towed up to Indonesia, it was actually broke free and ended up on Fiona Beach up by Seal Rocks. And if anyone goes up there after a big low goes through, sometimes you can actually see it exposed on the beach as well. So at about 3 a.m. on the 31st of May, the final Midget submarine enters the harbour, and this is the M22. By this stage, the harbour's on high alert. There's numerous vessels tearing back and forth looking for the submarines. And the M24 basically makes it as far as Taylor's Bay before it's discovered. Now, it's repeatedly depth charged. The crew realise that there's no escape for them, so they actually shoot themselves and commit suicide. At about 1 a.m, the M24 crosses indicator loop number 11. Now, at the time, this actually caused quite a bit of confusion because the Allies actually believed it was a 4th submarine entering the harbour. So they were actually looking for a 4th sub at this stage, but we now know it was actually the M24 leaving the harbour. So what was the aftermath of the raid? The M27 was destroyed in the boom nets by blowing up its scuttling charges. The M22 was repeatedly depth charged and the crew shot themselves in Taylor's Bay. The M24 fired its torpedo and sunk the Kuttabul, but then disappeared. Basically, it moved itself out of the harbour, and for 64 years, we never really knew what happened to the M24, and it became probably one of our greatest maritime mysteries. But it didn't really end there. The I-class submarines that were waiting for their midgets waited for 2 nights, and when they realised that they weren't returning, they went on to their secondary missions. The attack with the midget submarines was only one part of their mission. Their mission was then to disrupt Allied shipping on the east coast as much as possible. So on the 8th of June, the I-24 surfaced basically off of Macquarie Lighthouse, off of Sydney, and fired 10 rounds from its deck gun. Now, these rounds weren't incredibly effective. Most of them were actually armoured piercing. They weren't really designed to be fired at soft targets like buildings and things like that. And only one of them actually detonated and didn't really cause a great deal of damage. There wasn't many injuries and there was certainly no deaths. When the I-24 started its bombardment, the alarm was raised, and Lieutenant George Cantella, who was an American air serviceman at Bankstown, was scrambled. He took off in his Air Cobra, but unfortunately the aircraft crashed quite soon afterwards and he was killed. It was a little bit controversial at the time. There were some reports that Cantello might have actually ignored orders and taken off when he shouldn't have, but it appears that his engine failed and unfortunately he was killed. And in 2008, there was actually a memorial put out towards where he crashed at Liverpool. And if anyone's out that way, there's a lovely memorial to the Kuttabul and also to Cantello out there. But it's a little bit of the unknown history of this actually the raids. One of the areas that was actually shelled was a grocery store, which was on the corner of Fletcher and Small Streets in Wallara. And you can see from the images there, that's what the building looked like in 1942, and the same building is still standing today. On the left, you can see it there. And if you happen to be down that way, there's a small memorial plaque that's in the footpath there as well, which is worth having a look at. Now, at the same time, the I-21 surfaced off of Newcastle and shelled Newcastle. Apparently, its target was the BHP Steelworks. Again, the majority of the rounds didn't detonate, they were armoured piercing, but also some of the rounds were actually affected by saltwater ingress, and they also didn't detonate for those reasons as well. But interestingly, when the I-21 shelled Newcastle, Fort Scratchley came into operation and returned fire. And in so doing, became the only Australian coastal fortification to fire on enemy ship during the Second World War. Unfortunately, by the time the guns were brought into operation, the I-21 had actually submerged and disappeared. The I-class submarines then continued on along up and down the east coast, actually trying to find any Allied targets they could find. The Iron Chieftain was sunk by the I-24. The Iron Crane was sunk by the I-27, and the SS Guatemala was attacked by the I-21. Now, the post-attack, when the two sets of crew from the M22 and the M24 were recovered, Rear Admiral Muirhead Gould actually decided to give them a full military honour funeral. This was extremely controversial at the time. Their bodies were taken out to Rookwood Cemetery. They were cremated. They had the Japanese flag put over their coffins, and they were given us a military salute. And about 3 or 4 months later, the remains of the crew were actually returned back to Japan through diplomatic channels, which during wartime was quite an amazing feat. Now, Muirhead Gould was roundly criticised for this, but his reasoning was, one, that the crews were extremely brave. It was a very brave act to, come into a harbour and attack in these tiny little midget submarines. But his reasoning was also that if the Allies showed compassion and respect for the Japanese dead, he was hoping that the same would also be given to the Allied dead as well. The other reason was that obviously a great deal of British and Australians had been taken captive and were being held by the Japanese in Japan, and they were hoping that in Singapore, and they were hoping that there would be good treatment for the POWs. Unfortunately, when the returned to Japan, it was used as a propaganda aid, and the Allies then banned that sort of service ever taking place again. So the two submarines that were recovered out of Sydney Harbour, both of them were recovered within a couple of days of each other. They were then basically stripped apart. The Navy wanted to find out what made them tick, how they operated. Then they were put on trucks and they were sent on an Australian-wide campaign, which was for the Navy Relief Fund and the King George Fund for merchant sailors. The idea was that you could buy war bonds and things like that and support the war effort. And you can see by the images here, they were basically trucked round. You would pay your couple of pound or whatever it was, shillings in those days, to come and actually have a look at the subs. And it's interesting to note too, you can see there was actually little windows that was actually cut into the side of the submarines, so you could have a look and see what they looked like inside. Interestingly, they actually made little mementos and things that you could buy as well. And on the bottom there, you can see there's a tiny little lead midget submarine. And that was made from the lead from the batteries inside the subs. So in the 50s, both the remains of the M22 and the M27 were taken to the Australian War Memorial. And if you've been to the War Memorial, to the Anzac Hall, you'll actually see a display that has the remains of the Midget sub, and this actually has the bridge from the HMS Kuttabul there as well. But interestingly, the submarine that you see at the War Memorial is actually not one submarine. It's actually a composite of two. So the conning tower and the aft sections are from the M27, and the bow section is actually from the M22. So it's actually two submarines that were put together to make that exhibition. However, the conning tower section of the M22 is at the Naval Heritage Centre at Garden Island. And again, if you have an interest in history and you want to see what these submarines look like, I would highly recommend going and having a look at it. And probably the first thing that will strike you is how incredibly tiny the submarines were. The little windows you can see, you can view inside and see what it was like. It was extremely cramped conditions for the two crew. And in fact, the crew were actually chosen often for their stature. The smaller the submariners, they thought would be better because there would be more room inside them. And if you're there, I'd actually recommend walking outside as well, because there's the memorial to the HMS Kuttabul as well. And every year, the Australian Navy actually has a memorial service for the Kuttabul and the loss of the crew. So, fast forward until 2006. Like I said, when the M24 disappeared, it was not seen again for 64 years, and it did become one of our greatest maritime mysteries. There was well over 50 reported instances of things being found and thought being the submarine, but it wasn't until November 2006 that a group called themselves No Frills Divers from the Northern Beaches, which I'm sure a lot of people here might know, actually found the submarine sitting in 56 metres. So the submarine's located about 3 nautical miles or 5 kilometres off Bungan Head in 56 metres of water. It's sitting pretty much upright on the seafloor. When the guys first found it, it was pretty much covered in trawling nets, but apart from that, it's fairly intact. Top of the casing for the conning tower has been ripped off, probably by the trawling operations, and the wire cutters have been stripped away from the hull and they lie on the seafloor next to it. It's on a very flat, sandy bottom. There's nothing else out there. And for that reason, it's actually become an amazing haven for fish life as well. So when you go out to the site, probably the first thing that we pick up when we go out there is all the fish that are actually around the site itself. So on the 1st of December 2006, because of the significance of the site, the Australian government moved to protect it immediately. A 500-metre protection zone was immediately declared around the site. It was declared an historic shipwreck. There was also a New South Wales Heritage interim order, which was put on the site to protect it. And the site was, in 2007, listed on the New South Wales State Heritage Register. To ensure that the site could be properly examined, the protection zone was put around it. There was actually an acoustic buoy put on the site originally, which is the image you can see in front here, where it actually had a camera mounted in it, and if you went too close, it would set the camera off, send the information back, and you could tell that someone was inside the protected zone. That buoy no longer is on the site, but there is a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week surveillance onshore system that actually monitors the site. So the first preliminary archaeological surveys were undertaken by the Royal Australian Navy. Now, there was a couple of reasons for this. One of our main concerns, or everyone's main concern, was the threat of unexploded ordnance. We know that the M24 fired its torpedoes, but it still had its scuttling charges on. So one of the first things that had to be established was, is this site dangerous? Is it going to be a danger to divers or anyone who accesses the site? So the Royal Australian Navy clearance divers went down and looked at it. The other issue that we have, I suppose, is it is a very deep site. It's 56 metres. And unfortunately, working for state government, it's outside of the depth limits that we're allowed to operate in. So we're under the Commercial Code 2299, which means that we actually can't dive the site ourselves. So we had to get the Navy in to do the initial survey work for us. One of the first things they were looking for was actually identifying the site itself. Now, as I mentioned, those wire cutters are a very diagnostic feature. We know that the Type A version 1s had them on them. So one of the first things that we actually found, you can see on the image here, there's the wishbone wire cutter laying on the seafloor. The other thing that we wanted to know is does this submarine have the torpedo tubes empty, which the M24 did? And you can see the images there showing the empty torpedo tubes. The next thing we wanted to establish was, were the crew still on board? Was there any way if we could tell if the crew ever got off? Were they still inside it? A number of studies were done. We actually put video cameras down inside the hatchways, and what we found is that the access ladder, which you can see in the image here, was still in the upward stowed position. So we know that the crew are still inside. They couldn't have got out through the top without actually pulling the access ladder down. So by establishing that that ladder is in the upwards position, the hatches are closed, we know that the crew was still on board. So the initial inspections were to look at those things: safety of the site. We also wanted to understand site conditions. How fragile is this site? We wanted to understand, is there ordnance still on the site? And we wanted to know, what the overall integrity of the site was. The other important issue, I suppose, is to realise, and this has always been something that we've been very keen to tell people, is this is not just a shipwreck. It's actually the grave site of the two submariners. So we know that Sub-Lieutenant Ban and Petty Officer Ashibe are still on board. So we're dealing with, it's their final resting place. It is a grave where their remains are still encapsulated inside the submarine. To mark respect to that, there's been a number of ceremonies that we've conducted over the years on the site. In 2008, the Royal Australian Navy actually recovered sediment and sand from around the site, and that was sent back to the surviving family members of the two crew, and they actually put them in their family shrines. And in 2013, we had this gentleman here, you can see in front of you, is Dr. Genjitsu Sen. He is a Japanese tea master, and he actually came over and did a tea ceremony above the site. Very interesting man himself. He was actually an Imperial Japanese Navy pilot during the war, and now he's become a very much a peace ambassador who goes around the world and does these tea ceremonies. He's done one on the USS Arizona in Pearl Harbor, and he came to Sydney and did the tea ceremony over the M24, where he puts the ceremonial tea into a bowl and gives it as an offering and lowers it down to the crew of the submarine below. Very moving ceremony. So the detailed archaeological surveys were undertaken. We got a lot of assistance from, Royal Australian Navy, Defence Force, the Water Police, Ports Corporation. They've all been fantastic in helping us over a number of years and actually doing all the survey work on this site. And I was lucky enough in 2016 to go out with the Royal Australian Navy, who gave us the use of one of their mine hunters, the HMS Diamantina, and we're able to use their advanced survey equipment for doing work on the site as well. So over about 11-year period, we've done a number of surveys. There's the archaeological survey report is now available, and you can find that on our webpage. I suppose the big thing I want to get across is that all the information that we are gathering and all the research we are doing is meant to be publicly disseminated. This is information we want to get out to the public. This is for people to be able to access. And to do that, we've actually created a web exhibition. And you can see on the left-hand side there, huge amount of information about the sites. You'll be able to find our survey reports there. You'll be able to find further historical information. And that's something that we really want to promote to get out into the public domain as well. And I suppose the Australian government, the New South Wales government, is quite lucky that we were also given a UNESCO award, which is on the right-hand side here, showing that that the work the government has been doing has actually, been recognised on an international level, I suppose. There's also interpretive plaques. There's a big one at Mona Vale Head. This is the closest point to where the M24 rests today. We had a lovely ceremony where it was officially opened by the Navy, and we even had a Catalina flying boat do a fly past on that. But I suppose one of the big issues is before the site could be considered to be opened or inspected by members of the public, one of the big things that we really needed to know was the question of the scuttling charges. We know that the M24 was carrying scuttling charges, but one of the things we need to establish was, are they still active? Are they still potentially a threat? Dr. Brad Duncan, who's my colleague, has done a fantastic unexploded ordnance survey, and we've been able to establish the charges are still on there. They potentially could be live, or because of the period of time that's expired, they may be, completely innocuous. They may be unlikely to go off anymore. But I suppose the big thing, like any unexploded ordnance, is there's still the potential there. We actually did a slurp test where we actually took up sediment and sand from around the site and actually tested it for the chemicals that we know were in the scuttling charges, and we haven't been able to find any. That could mean two things. Potentially they're still in there, or they've just dispersed over a long period of time. This report will actually be made publicly available very, very soon on our webpage, and I'd say if you're interested in Ordnance, it's a really interesting report to have a look at as well. So ongoing inspections. We are monitoring the site on a regular basis. Two things that we're doing is we're having regular ultrasonic thickness tests done, which is on the left-hand side here, which is an instrument that actually looks at the thickness of the hull. Obviously, it's a steel hull. It's deteriorating over time. It's well over 75 years old now. And we want to monitor its corrosion. But one of the things we've done to arrest that corrosion and slow it down is we've actually put in place cathodic protection. So you can see on the top right-hand image there's actually an anode that's been attached to the rear section of the submarine. Now that zinc anode corrodes in preference to the hull itself, and it's going to slow down the corrosion or arrest the corrosion. And obviously the aim is to preserve this site for as long as possible. So we're actively monitoring and we're actively keeping the site as pristine as possible. Now, one of the big questions has been, are we able to actually visit the submarine site itself? There has been a moratorium on diving since the site was first discovered, and there's a number of reasons for that, and I think I sort of covered a few of those. One has been respect to the submariners that are on there and their families. The other was obviously the question of ordnance and safety of the site, the integrity of the site and things like that. But it always has been the idea or aim to actually open it up on a controlled basis to the diving public, people who actually want to go and see the site itself. In 2011, we actually put together a proposal to have a trial dive to see how many people would be interested in whether we could get people come down in a respectful manner and view the submarine itself. Unfortunately, there was a number of issues where potentially people had actually accessed the site illegally and it was closed down, and that's unfortunately put our program back a number of years. In 2017, we established that we were going to do the trial again, but as part of that, we wanted to establish baseline measurements. We wanted to look at the submarine and get a full recording of the site as it sits today. To do that, we decided to do a photogrammetry survey, and we actually got the Explorers Club of Australia and New Zealand to actually do the survey for us. We had, expedition was actually led by Matt Carter, which tech divers might know, he's a New Zealand Maritime Archaeologist, very experienced. The guys actually did photogrammetry of the site using Agisoft, and again, because of the depth, with their tech diving equipment, they could go down for a lot longer and actually do the surveys for a greater period of time. So the results of that were that we've got 3D animations of the site. Now, I'll try to play these for you. Hopefully they're going to work. Now, this gives you an idea of what the submarine looks like. Like I said, it gives you a baseline measurement. We know what the submarine looked like in 2017. We can compare it every year to see how the site's changing over time. The other thing is, it's a great tool for people who are not divers. Most people will never be able to dive this site 56 meters and never be able to see it. But we now have these animations available through our webpage. So anyone can sit in their lounge room and do a little 3D animation tour of the site and see what it looks like. So I'll just see if I can get these to work for you. So that gives you a view of what the submarine looks like. So you can see the conning tower sitting in the middle there. Not damaged, the corrosion you can see behind there is actually where the battery compartment is. A lot of people have asked if that's battle damage. It's actually just corrosion from where the battery compartments are. You can see the conning tower sitting up. Now, what I'll do is there's another one here. This is sort of like the diver's eye view. So you're coming down from the stern along the starboard side. There's the corrosion hole I was talking about, and you can see the conning tower on the left. You're now going to whiz around the front to see the torpedo tubes. And the image in the top that's a bit blurry is actually a wobbegong that's sitting in there. You can come along the port side. And if you look down on the sea floor, you'll actually be able to see that wishbone wire cutter that I mentioned earlier as well. and then coming back around to the stern again. So a fantastic tool for us for management, but also a fantastic tool for people to be able to see the site as well. So to coincide with the 75th anniversary, we wanted to operate a trial open diver day where we'd give 12 permits to divers to actually come out and visit the site. Now, we weren't sure how many people would have actually applied for these permits, and we wanted to be as equal and equitable as possible. So to do that, we held an open ballot. Now, we had 12 positions, and for those 12 positions, we had 301 applications. So it was very well received. The image you can see in front here is actually my director on the left, Pauline McKenzie, my executive director, and director of operations, Tim Smith, and they're actually drawing the ballot out. Again, we had to go through a whole process to show it was independent. It had to be completely non-biased. So we put everything to a ballot box, and we were very fortunate in getting an historic ballot box. The one that you can see there is actually a ballot box that was used by the Lands Department in the early 1900s to actually draw out lots for people to get land grants in Western New South Wales. So it's nice to see something historic being used for that as well. Now, the idea of the open day was to see if we could get how many people we'd get in it, and we wanted to be able to show the Japanese and Commonwealth governments that we could have people interested in diving this site, but also have respectful visitation, which I think was really the key thing to it as well. We ended up having 10 divers go down in 2 groups. Unfortunately, 2 divers had to drop out at the last minute, which was a real shame. And they were very, very lucky. Both groups went out. They had fantastic dive conditions, probably 30 meters plus, which on this site is extremely rare. And we actually had Fabio, who's from Dive, Spear and Sport, come out on the site and take one of the groups out there as well. And I was lucky enough to go out with both groups of divers, and they were fantastic. I think they were very respectful of the site. I think they were felt very privileged to be able to do it as well. And that was the whole idea of opening up to a trial event like this. And what I might do is we actually have Richard Nichols. I don't know if some of the divers here might know Richard. He was one of the guys who was actually came down on the second group and did the dive. I might just play you a quick video. I just think Richard is very eloquent in how he talks about the site and what he got out of it. And I think I'll talk a little bit later about what we're moving into next, the next phase of it. But this particular video has actually been sent off to the Japanese government, showing what we got out of the trial diver day. So I might just play this quickly for people. Hopefully you can hear this. That's not working. Okay, let me just.
Don't have any sound.
No sound. Let me just see if I can. Just bear with me 1 second. There we go. Let's try that one more time.
Awesome. Hi, my name's Richard Nichols. I've just had the most amazing experience diving on the Japanese mini-sub. First of all, we're super lucky today. As you may be able to see behind me, conditions are fantastic. There's virtually no swell, amazing visibility. What a great experience being able to dive on a part of history. One of the great joys, I think, of diving is being able to go back into the past. And it was a terrific experience there today. Great fun. Also, tinged with a little bit of sadness because at the end of the day, unfortunately, we've got two brave men. Even though they were fighting for an opposing side, you've got 2 brave men who are entombed within the mini sub itself. But what a great experience just to see it, the fish life. It's a great little site now. There's fish all over it, and really, from a tragedy, it's come a great new life. So thank you very much.
Okay, so I suppose what I'll probably talk a little bit now is where we're heading to now. Now, we had the trial day in 2017. We felt that was extremely successful. As I said, it's always been our aim to try and open the site to controlled diving. I think the trial was very successful. The big issue, I suppose, with this site is we do co-manage it. It's managed between the Commonwealth government, the New South Wales government, but also the Japanese government as well. When we're working on this site, we're always cognizant that we're working with a site that has 2 war dead from Japan. When we're doing work, we always inform the Japanese government. We always involve them in the actual processes that we go through for managing this site as well. So once we had the trial day, before leading up to the trial day, I suppose I should also mention that we did run this past the Japanese government, who then actually went to the families, the relatives, the living relatives of the two crew were still on board. And they said, yes, that sounds like a really good idea to trial it and see how we go. Now that we've done that, and that was, I would actually say that was 6 years of work to get to that stage. So it's been a very long process, but it's also been a very good process as well. Now that we've done the trial day, we have formally gone back to the Japanese government, and we have actually said that we would like to open it on a regular basis, and that we would like to control diver visitation to the site. Where we're at the moment is they have formally gone to the relatives of the two submariners and put the proposal to them, and hopefully sometime soon we will be able to get a reply from the relatives, and all going well, we're looking at controlled access visitation to the M24 sometime in the near future. So I would say keep listening, and hopefully we'll be having to make an announcement about that soon. Now, I've just put a couple of quick links up on on the screen there. There's the Midget Submarine webpage, which has our web exhibition. You can have a look at the history and everything there. There's also a link to our Maritime Heritage program, and also a link to the New South Wales State Heritage Register, which has a listing for the M24. Now, I've been doing a lot of talking, so I think what I might do is maybe answer some questions, or if anybody else would like any more information, please let me know.
Awesome, that's so interesting, Stirling. Thank you so much. Guys, do we have any questions out there? If you just want to just pop a quick note in the chat, and we'll pass it over to you. Just give everyone a minute. Alternatively, if anyone wants to, here we go. Andrew, do you want to go first, mate? Andrew Jones, would you like to ask?
Sorry, I was just wondering, are there any clues as to why it sank where it did? I think it was heading back to rendezvous with the main subs. Was there any hints as to why it sank?
It was, yeah, and that's the interesting thing. Again, as I said before, these weren't necessarily suicide. Well, they weren't suicide missions. The submarines were meant to return to their mother subs, and we know that they were heading towards Broken Bay. So the M24 was trying to get back to its rendezvous. The thing is, though, by the time the submarine had got out of the harbour and headed up north, it was getting very close to daybreak. So the crew knew that they wouldn't be able to surface. They would have given away their position. To exactly what happened to the crew, we're not exactly sure. We don't know if they ran out of oxygen. We don't know if they deliberately put the submarine on the seafloor. We don't know if they committed suicide. But we do know that they were heading towards that rendezvous, but it's unlikely that they fired their scuttling charges because they thought they may have given away their position. So by the time that they got out there, they would have been running very low on oxygen. The batteries probably would have been exhausted. So they probably just put the submarine down on the seafloor, and that was it.
I've heard some really interesting stories that there may have been Japanese spies on shore, both at Palm Beach and up on Kincumber Mountain on the Gosford side of Broken Bay, which is really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many amazing stories that go with it. You know, I only had somebody a couple of weeks ago saying that they had one of their relatives was at Barrenjoey Headland, and said that they could see the submarines. There's amazing stories that come out. I did a public talk a couple of years ago where I had a lovely lady who came up and showed me photos when she was a little girl. She lived in Cremorne and can remember the attack on Sydney Harbour, and her mother picking her up and putting her in the window so she could watch all the pretty colours as the guns were firing. So there's amazing stories that keep coming out of this, and you're learning more and more about this event all the time.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
It's super fascinating. Sterling, I have a couple of questions from John, and he just has said he doesn't have a microphone. The first was he wants to know if you have any ideas to the whereabouts of the other wrecks. I believe the plane, was that the main one you were referring to, John? I think so.
Yeah, look, we haven't found the Glen. I'd love to. I think it'd be absolutely fantastic to find that. It would be an amazing amazing discovery. We
Yeah, guys.
we don't know where. Obviously, they scuttled it, and it's quite possible that it wouldn't have sunk immediately. It could have been neutrally buoyant. It could have moved anywhere up and down the coastline. There was a report a number of years ago of a radial engine that was thought to maybe come from it, but it's never been confirmed. For just as a little bit of background, all the vessels that were involved in the raid didn't see out the end of the war. The USS Chicago and HMS Canberra were both sunk. All 3 Midgets were obviously sunk, and all the 5 I-class carrier submarines were also sunk by the end of the war as well. So none of the vessels that were involved in the raid didn't see the end of the war.
Yeah, John was actually asking about the I-series subs, if you have any idea as to their location.
Well, there's not. I don't know the ones that were involved in the raid. We do have the I-124 up in the Northern Territory, which we had a position of, and that's been known of for a number of years as well. Yeah, apart from that, I don't know about the other I classes that are involved in the raid. No.
No, that's okay. And another question he had was he was interested to know what qualifications would be mandated when dives are allowed.
Now that's a really interesting one. From our perspective, and this is why these things have taken so long, it was a lot of negotiations, obviously lots of legal issues. It has to go to lawyers and things like that. Essentially, for the open day, we did not mandate any dive conditions. We stood back from it and we said, we're not telling you how to dive it. We're not telling you what qualifications, whether you use compressed air. I wouldn't do it, but if you want to use compressed air or you want to use a rebreather, that's something that we don't get involved with. The only thing that we would do was actually give the permit. So personally, I think tech diving obviously seems to be the way to go. All the guys that did the open day, they were all on rebreathers and things like that. A number of years ago, 56 meters was very, very deep. Now with the tech industry the way it is, it's quite achievable diving. So from our perspective, we didn't and wouldn't get involved with telling people how that they actually dive the site. That would be something that people would have to take on board. And when we had the open day, I don't know if anyone here applied for it, we had like a 5-page disclaimer that people had to look at and sign, and basically saying you are responsible for your own diving operations.
Awesome. He also asked where he could get one of the little model subs. I said before, he said he wanted the 3D sub. I said, you said there were models.
That's one thing I didn't actually bring with me tonight. That 3D model that you saw produced that we did the fly round, we've actually printed out some 3D models of the sub as well. So we take them to exhibitions and to public talks and things like that. It's not something that we're looking at releasing, but we do actually have the 3D models as well, which we can use as a bit of an educational aid.
There you go, John. You're going to have to run into an exhibition and nab one. Sorry, Sterling, just joking. Okay, Matt Ames, do you want to ask your question, mate? Matt?
Yes, sorry. Yes, I've just realised I should think before I post, because it doesn't necessarily make too much sense. I was assuming that the float plane I-series would have been nearby the other I-series with the Midget subs on them. So if you knew the range of the Midget subs batteries, you might know roughly, or might have a narrowing down of the area where the float plane might have tried to land near its I-series. But then I realized it probably wouldn't be anywhere near the other ones, because it just makes it far too much of an easy target.
Yeah, look, the carrier subs actually found out, all 3 of them found out in an arc around the entrance of Sydney Harbour. So they were supposedly quite separate from the float plane reconnaissance carriers. But yeah, look, I'm sure smarter people than me that could actually figure out the range of these aircraft and their probable courses. And we do actually have the flight officer's notes and everything that he took. But yeah, it's just, again, one of those fantastic research projects if you've got the time.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Guys, do we have any more questions out there? Feel free to...
Yeah, go ahead. Stirling, that's the best presentation I've ever heard on the M24. I've been on numerous tours around Sydney Harbour that have looked at the history of this, but that was just fabulous. So thank you. What I wanted to ask was, how limited were these submarines with their power? How far could they actually go did they have limited time to be able to carry out the task and get back to base?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question, and it really comes down to how hard they were pushing them. Basically, their endurance, their range wasn't that great, and that's the interesting thing about the M24. It was absolutely at the extremes of its range. It had gone into the harbour, attacked, and where she ended up, that's why we know that it was pretty much out of power. So I think their top speed was only about 9 knots, and that was flat out. So, and their crawling speed was about 2 knots. And again, you've got currents, you've got tides, all those sorts of things that take into consideration. So their endurance was only, it could be as low as 4 or 5 hours, depending how hard they were pushing them.